Here's a question. Why is Lovecraft popular? I mean, he's popular because of Cthulhu. People like Cthulhu. He's popular because he's a good writer. People like to read weird stories and stuff. He's popular because there's tons of video games and merchandise and RPGs and board games and shit all about him. But that's not why he's popular, right? Think about it. That is the result of his popularity. That all stems from some initial thing that made him popular to begin with. But what was that? What made him initially popular? I spent a good few days thinking about the subject and making notes and reading articles. And these are my conclusions as to why Lovecraft is popular initially and why he is still popular to this day. Yeah, let's go. Sometimes a good idea at the right time is all you need. Let's look at horror up until the early 20th century. Horror was quite a limited genre then. You had Poe, obviously, but also authors like Sheridan Le Fanu, Bram Stoker, Elizabeth Gaskell, M.R. James, Wilkie Collins, and Henry James. All these authors are respectable in their own right, but most of their stories involve ghosts, vampires, werewolves, witches, and creepy settings like castles and so on. Very stereotypical horror if you think about it. You had your Penny Dreadfuls, but they focus more on gory killings, probably spiked by the hype of the Jack the Ripper murders. So everything is sort of very traditional horror, nothing too revolutionary there, right? Meaning there is room for innovation and something new. In short, there was a hole that needed to be filled by a man or woman with the right idea, and that man was Robert Chambers. Yeah, here's a twist. In my opinion, Robert Chambers' short story The Yellow Sign is a Lovecraft prototype. It is definitely Lovecraftian, but it's very crudely so. I mean that it has the right ideas, but it's lacking Lovecraft's touch and refinement. Of course there is Arthur Machen and Lord Dunsany, both beloved by H.P. Lovecraft, but never having his touch, or never nailing what Lovecraftian horror really is. Lovecraft, influenced by these writers, started writing, guided by his own singular disposition and intelligence as a human being, and created the stories we see now. These stories, the themes, concepts, and imagery in them revolutionized horror. He created something unheard of, something fresh, new, and frankly more terrifying than any other form of horror before. It resonated well with enough people, and after his death his work started to get published properly in book form. This is the key reason why Lovecraft is famous. That initial spark that attracted just a few people, just the right amount of people. It wasn't a big spark, no inferno, he didn't take the world by storm. He died in obscurity save for his small network of friends. But that little spark had its effect on them, and his works lived on because of it. Every other reason I will present now is merely a side effect of the reason I've just stated. He isn't famous because, for example, there are board games of his monsters. Those board games only exist because of his initial good idea. That's a very important distinction to make. When Lovecraft died, his works were scattered around the country in small, forgettable pulp magazines. He didn't have a catalogue somewhere at home with everything he wrote nicely typed out and categorized. He must have felt a terrible depression that the stories he lived for and that he gave his whole life for, his whole identity, would be forgotten. But he affected a few people enough that they wouldn't let him slip away into obscurity. We have Donald Wandry and August Derleth to thank for establishing the printing company called Arkham House and collecting all of his writings to be published. Because of them, his stories were saved, and now today we can find them in just about any bookstore. But it doesn't stop there. He had a circle of friends, the Lovecraft Circle, as they are known, who borrowed ideas from him and incorporated them into their own fiction. Each writer had a respectable career in their own right, and most likely in turn affected other writers with their ideas and stylings originally taken from Lovecraft. Think of Lovecraft as a small stone thrown into a pond and the ripples that came afterwards. These ripples continue today. Writers, ever since Lovecraft's death, right up until now, today, as I record this, are influenced by him because these people are naturally inclined to be avid readers or searchers after the weird and morbid. Not just writers are influenced by him. For example, Sandy Peterson is a name you might not know. But because this one guy, Sandy Peterson, happened to be interested in Lovecraft, we have the Call of Cthulhu RPG, which has been around since the 70s, and I think it's the reason why Lovecraft entered mainstream pop culture. In short, Lovecraft is appreciated by enough people who go on to insert his ideas into their own artistic creations, and then present these ideas to their audience. The audience members might think, whoa, that's a really cool idea, and then they might start searching where these ideas originated from, and then, hey, they're reading Lovecraft. Incidentally, this is exactly what happened to me. I was in a bookstore one day when I was about 15 or 16, and I found this book by Graham Masterton called Prey, and it was all about these eldritch gods from beyond space and time. One of them called Yog-Sothoth. I thought, that's so weird, I've never heard a name like that before. Eventually I googled it, and then I saw Lovecraft came up, and that's how I got into Lovecraft. Lovecraft may have not intended to build up a mythos or a canon like you'd see, for example, in the Alien franchise, where you have official backstories for the planets, the creatures, and the characters, and so on. But he created the separate building blocks for many people to work with in regards to the Lovecraft mythos. Lovecraft created a fascinating world where creatures never imagined before lived. Deep ones, tentacled behemoths, flying polyps, flying space bugs, whatever the hell this thing is supposed to be. All completely fresh and unseen in the horror world then. He created fascinating worlds like Yuggoth and the Dreamlands, which are described loosely enough to allow imagination some freedom, but well enough to be places you can imagine distinctly and with having distinct characteristics. In other words, Lovecraft was very specific in what his creations and characters were. However, he was very vague sometimes, calling the monsters indescribable and the geometry of places like Arlia all wrong. This allows creators of Lovecraftian content some freedom to decide what all wrong means and how an indescribable monster might actually look like. I think artists and writers really enjoy that sort of freedom. For example, if you wanted to make an incarnation of the Joker from Batman, you would be quite constricted on how he is portrayed. Any fuck-ups in this regard and any deviation from the expected character and you will be crucified by the fans. Jared Leto's Joker from Suicide Squad suffered in this regard. People said he was a little bit too overacted or a little bit too forced. Well, that's what I read on forums anyway. Or look at how the internet almost shit itself because Kylo Ren's lightsaber had a crossguard. In the mythos, yeah, there are some restrictions, but as long as your portrayal still has the basic ideas of cosmicism in it, it's acceptable. Also, the aesthetics of Lovecraft's mythos are quite unique and bold. If I say to you, imagine a gothic castle, or imagine a steampunk aeroplane, immediately you can do this. The imagery and tropes of steampunk and gothic horror pops right into your mind, and you assemble your thoughts and you can produce this idea of the gothic castle or a steampunk aeroplane very quickly. In my opinion, it's the same for the mythos, if you know even a little bit about the mythos. For example, it's probably set in the 1920s or 30s. Landscapes are set in dreamlike worlds or nightmarish places like Yuggoth or Arlia, where everything looks like a surreal nightmare. You've got lots of green phosphorescent lighting, and as for the quintessential creature, a writhing mass of tentacles, horrific mouths, and really fucked up to look at. That is the visual aesthetic that you will see in most depictions of the Lovecraft universe. When I researched who held the copyright to Lovecraft, I found a mess of very grey area claims. In US law, anything published before 1923 is public domain. In many European countries, it goes that 70 years after a person's death, their creations are public domain. Here are some too long didn't read articles if you care to read about them. Anyway, the point is that numerous publishers have released collections of Lovecraft's works. Some big publishers would be the Library of America, Barnes & Nobles, Knickerbocker, and some others. The most notable is Penguin, who have released his works in the Penguin Classics editions. Penguin Classics are pretty much in any bookstore these days, so that really helps with spreading Lovecraft around. Add to this, there are also smaller publishers like Chaosium, Hippocampus Press, and Arkham House who all work very hard to release his stories, as well as story anthologies from other Lovecraftian authors. The loose nature of his copyright means that people can happily recreate his stories as they see fit. Or, if I'm mistaken about all of this, then at least you can say that there's no stranglehold over Lovecraft and his creations like Disney has over its own assets. Personally, I have no respect for any copyright claims on any of his works. Lovecraft always encouraged his friends and contemporaries to copy his characters, locations, and ideas taken from his own works and put into their own works. So for some company like Arkham House, Chaosium to come along and claim copyright is utter bullshit in my eyes. I will never respect that. I did a whole video explaining why I think this way, so I suggest you just go and watch that and take that as the reason for this video. But in a very condensed version, I think Lovecraftian horror is the scariest type of horror because it always ends badly for humanity. There are no happy endings in Lovecraft stories, basically. Not only that, but his philosophies are intrinsic to his horror, and that undermines the whole notion that humans are something important in the world. This is a uniqueness and an appeal to horror fans, I think. They really respect that sort of horror. I mean, how many authors have had their names turned into an adjective to describe something? Or have basically thousands of stories created under a subgenre named after them? Not Stephen King, not Dean Koontz, not Bram Stoker, not Clive Barker. Just Lovecraft. Out of all of Lovecraft's monstrous creations, I think Cthulhu is the easiest to picture. Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, and Shub-Niggurath are more powerful entities in the mythos, but they're not exactly as easy to picture in your mind. But Cthulhu is humanoid, has wings, and an octopus for a face. It's a lot easier to imagine, therefore a lot easier to draw, to paint, or to make toys of. That helps a lot in becoming an iconic image, and also for marketing purposes as well. The Call of Cthulhu RPG realized this, and then that became a bestseller, and I think that's just because of Cthulhu alone. Nowadays, in my opinion, people are more likely to even know the name Cthulhu than they are to know Lovecraft. I have a tattoo on my arm of the Elder Sign. When people ask me what it means, I always ask them, do you know who Lovecraft is? And if they reply no, then I always ask, do you know who Cthulhu is? And more often than not, they'll say, yeah, okay, I know Cthulhu. So definitely Cthulhu helps in getting people into Lovecraft's actual writings, even if their only contact to the mythos is from an RPG or video game bearing Cthulhu's name. Finally, Cosmicism is a reason why Lovecraft is popular, I think. Bram Stoker wanted to make a horror story not undermine human understanding of reality. H.P. Lovecraft was different. His horror not only was about the fun and interesting monsters, but it also came packaged with the soul-annihilating existentialism. Thus, I think that some people who get involved in Lovecraft later develop a respect for the man, not only as a good writer, but also as a bit of a philosopher. How many other writers can say that? I wouldn't call this as a big reason, but it's still worth mentioning. I should also note that I made a whole video about Cosmicism. I really think you should check it out if you don't know what Cosmicism is. I think I explained it quite well there, and it'll give you a good idea what I'm talking about here. So in my opinion, this is why Lovecraft is popular. He had a great idea, a unique writing style, and a philosophy that he integrated into his works with it that was never really presented well before. You know, you had examples like Robert Chambers with the Yellow Sign, but never before Lovecraft came along where his ideas of Cosmicism and this sort of existential horror integrated into horror so well. And because of his great idea, he resonated with the right people at the right time. Just a few circle of friends, they loved his works enough that when he died, they came together and published his works, and that was really the trigger that created the Lovecraft popularity, in my opinion. Anyway, that's my video. Nothing else to say really. Cheers.